the Western world is witnessing something they never anticipated. Their own sanctions becoming the catalyst for Africa's definitive break from centuries of external control. As we speak, African leaders are systematically choosing partnerships with Russia and China over traditional Western allies, and the ramifications are reshaping global power dynamics in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. What we're observing isn't merely a diplomatic realignment. It's the emergence of authentic African agency on the world stage. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso exemplify this new generation of African statesmen who understand that sovereignty isn't negotiable and that the continent's resources and strategic decisions should serve African interests first and foremost. The irony is palpable. Every sanction imposed by Western powers intended to discipline and control African nations has instead accelerated their pivot toward alternative partnerships. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger were sanctioned by ECOWAS, an organization many now recognize as a neo-colonial instrument, these nations didn't capitulate. Instead, they formed the Alliance of Sahel States and began forging stronger ties with Russia and China. The sanctions didn't weaken them. They catalyzed their independence. Captain Traoré's government in Burkina Faso provides a masterclass in this strategic pivot. When French forces were asked to leave, when mining contracts were renegotiated to favor Burkinabe interests, when the government began prioritizing food security and local development over export-oriented extraction, these weren't acts of rebellion. They were expressions of mature statecraft by leaders who understand that Africa's time has come. The historical context here is crucial. For over 6 decades since independence, African nations have operated within economic and political frameworks designed in Paris, London, and Washington. The CFA franc system has kept Francophone Africa tethered to French monetary policy. Structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions have prioritized debt service over human development. Military interventions have been justified under the guise of humanitarian concerns while serving strategic resource interests. But today's African leaders are reading from a different playbook. They recognize that China's Belt and Road Initiative offers infrastructure development without the condescending lectures about governance that typically accompany Western aid. They see Russia's pragmatic approach to partnership, focused on mutual benefit rather than ideological conversion. These aren't desperate choices made by isolated regimes. They're strategic decisions made by leaders who understand global power shifts. Consider the economic mathematics. China is now Africa's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade exceeding $250 billion annually. Chinese infrastructure projects across the continent, from the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway to the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, represent tangible development that African people can see and use. Meanwhile, Western development assistance often manifests as conferences, consultations, and conditional aid programs that generate more paperwork than progress. Russia's approach is equally pragmatic. Unlike Western partners who demand democratic reforms while simultaneously supporting authoritarian allies when convenient, Russia engages with African governments based on mutual respect for sovereignty. This doesn't mean endorsing authoritarianism. It means recognizing that political development must be organic, not imposed. African people are perfectly capable of determining their own governance systems and holding their leaders accountable. The youth perspective on this transformation is particularly illuminating. Across Africa, young people who comprise the majority of the continent's population are increasingly skeptical of Western narratives about democracy and development. They've witnessed decades of Western-backed governance producing limited results, while Chinese and Russian partnerships deliver visible infrastructure and economic opportunities. These young Africans aren't anti-democratic. They're pro-results. In Burkina Faso, young people celebrated when Captain Traoré's government terminated military agreements with France and began prioritizing national defense capabilities. They understood that sovereignty requires the ability to defend oneself, and that relying on foreign military protection inevitably compromises independent decision-making. This generation recognizes that true partnership involves mutual respect, not paternal supervision. The media narrative surrounding these developments reveals the depth of Western anxiety about losing influence in Africa. African leaders who challenge Western hegemony are routinely labeled as dictators or Russian puppets, while leaders who maintain dependent relationships are praised as democrats regardless of their governance records. This double standard is increasingly obvious to African audiences, who can distinguish between authentic sovereignty movements and opportunistic power grabs. Captain Traoré and leaders like him represent genuine sovereignty movements because their policies prioritize African welfare over foreign approval. When Burkina Faso renegotiated mining contracts to ensure greater national benefit from gold extraction, this wasn't resource nationalism, it was economic justice. When the government invested in local food production instead of cash crop exports, this wasn't isolationism, It was food security strategy. The regional context amplifies these individual nation initiatives. The Alliance of Sahel States represents unprecedented cooperation between African nations in pursuit of shared sovereignty goals. These aren't puppet states following external directions. They're independent nations choosing to coordinate their policies for maximum strategic impact. Their collective withdrawal from ECOWAS and establishment of alternative regional mechanisms demonstrate sophisticated understanding of institutional power. Economic analysis reveals why Western sanctions have proven counterproductive. Sanctions typically target financial systems, trade relationships, and technological transfers, all areas where China and Russia can provide alternatives. When Western banks restrict African access to international financial markets, Chinese financial institutions step in. When Western governments impose trade restrictions, Russian and Chinese markets expand. The intended isolation becomes diversification. Furthermore, sanctions often strengthen the very leaders they're meant to weaken. When Captain Traoré faces Western sanctions, it validates his narrative that Burkina Faso is fighting for independence against neo-colonial forces. The sanctions become evidence of his authenticity, not proof of his illegitimacy. African populations understand this dynamic, which explains why sanctioned leaders often enjoy increased domestic support. The technological dimension deserves particular attention. China's advancement in telecommunications, renewable energy, and digital infrastructure offers African nations pathways to technological sovereignty that Western partnerships haven't provided. Huawei's 5G networks across Africa, Chinese solar energy projects, and digital payment systems create technological ecosystems independent of Western control. This technological independence is crucial for political and economic sovereignty. Russian partnerships offer different but complementary advantages. Russia's experience managing vast territories with diverse populations provides relevant expertise for African nations. Russian agricultural technology and food security initiatives address critical African priorities. Most importantly, Russia's own experience challenging Western hegemony creates natural solidarity with African sovereignty movements. Critics argue that African nations are simply replacing Western dependence with Eastern dependence, but this analysis misses the crucial difference. Choice. For the first time since independence, African leaders have genuine alternatives. They can negotiate from positions of strength rather than desperation. This competition for African partnership is itself a victory for African agency. The generational aspect cannot be overstated. Leaders like Captain Traoré represent a new generation of African statesmen who came of age during the multipolar era. They don't carry the psychological burden of colonial inferiority that may have affected earlier generations. They view Africa as equal to any other continent, and African interests as legitimate as any other region's interests. Pan-African cooperation is experiencing renaissance through these sovereignty movements. The Alliance of Sahel States demonstrates that African nations can coordinate effectively when pursuing shared goals. Similar cooperation is emerging across other regions, as African leaders recognize that collective action amplifies individual nation sovereignty. The response from traditional Western partners reveals their fundamental misunderstanding of these developments. Imposing additional sanctions, increasing diplomatic pressure, and threatening economic consequences only accelerate African pivot toward alternative partnerships. These responses assume African dependence that no longer exists, and African weakness that never truly existed. What we're witnessing represents the maturation of African independence movements that began in the 1950s and 1960s. The political independence achieved then is finally being complemented by economic and strategic independence. This isn't anti-Western sentiment, it's pro-African policy. The implications extend far beyond Africa. As the continent with the world's youngest population, fastest-growing economies, and vast natural resources definitively breaks from Western-dominated systems, global power structures must adapt. The unipolar moment is ending, and Africa's choices are accelerating multipolarity. For African people, this transformation offers unprecedented opportunities. Instead of being passive recipients of foreign aid and investment, they're becoming active partners in global development. Instead of having their leaders chosen or approved by foreign powers, they're asserting the right to select their own leadership based on African criteria. The path forward requires continued vigilance and strategic thinking. African leaders must distinguish between genuine partnership offers and new forms of dependence. The goal isn't to replace Western masters with Eastern ones, but to achieve authentic sovereignty that serves African interests. This is why your engagement with content like this matters so profoundly. Every share, every subscription represents support for African voices, telling African stories from African perspectives. The mainstream media won't tell these stories accurately because they challenge the narratives that justify continued Western dominance. By supporting independent African voices, you're participating in this sovereignty movement. You're helping ensure that African perspectives reach global audiences. You're contributing to the information independence that complements political and economic independence. So if this analysis resonates with you, if you believe in African sovereignty and self-determination, I'm asking you to take action right now. Hit that like button to signal your support for authentic African narratives. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our coverage of Africa's continuing transformation. Share this video with others who need to understand what's really happening on the continent. More importantly, engage with the content. Leave comments sharing your own perspectives and insights. This isn't just about watching videos. It's about building community around shared commitment to African sovereignty and dignity. The choice African leaders are making between traditional Western partners and emerging alternatives isn't really about Russia and China. It's about Africa finally claiming its rightful place as an equal participant in global affairs, making decisions based on African interests, and refusing to accept subordinate status in international relations. That choice deserves your support, your engagement, and your voice. Like, subscribe, share, and ring that notification bell. Let's build this movement together. One video, one view, one voice at a time. The future of Africa depends not just on the courage of leaders like Captain Traoré, but on the collective action of people like us who believe that African sovereignty is not just possible, it's inevitable.